Hey y'all, we're gonna start this workshop. If I can have everyone's attention. Hello. So
Everybody.
hello, come up to the front if you wanna be part of this workshop. My name is Luce. I'm really excited to share this material with y'all. Can you hear me okay? Are there speakers? How about I keep talking and let's see if this sounds better. Yeah? This sounds better?
Okay. Is that okay, Con?
Is this the
Sounds
right
good.
volume?
It sounds good. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, so my name is Luce. I use they, them pronouns. Before I get into our content and introducing myself and the team, I'd actually like to learn a little bit about y'all. First of all, raise your hand if you're here because you're trying to get better as a candidate in technical interviews. Okay, that's great. I'm glad you're here, and I hope this hasn't been too confusing. This workshop's actually geared towards interviewers. Sometimes you'll probably learn a lot from peeling back this curtain, and there will be a practice. We'll do some practice activities. You'll have a chance to actually be a candidate. That's quite helpful for us. But sorry if this was a confusion. I won't be offended if you feel like you need to leave. Let's have another, raise your hand if you've interviewed, been on the other side of this table and you've interviewed before. Awesome, cool. What was difficult about, like, what was hard about this? What's hard about interviewing people? What kind of things have you encountered? What, you said all of it? Yeah, is there something else? Yeah. Here, I'm gonna throw this at you.
We're broadcasting this live right now, so if you use this, then we can, if you can hear it, the World Wide Web.
Talking to the This is amazing. Asking the right questions, not getting too deep down in the weeds, like with something that's like brain teasery, and not getting like to the point where it's like, hey, write as a web application because that's what you're going to be doing. So figuring out like a middle ground that like feels reasonable and solves like a meaningful problem.
Yeah, sure. And trying to do that in just like 1 hour
Exactly.
or in a limited amount of time. Yeah. Thanks for your help, Eli, if you want to help with the ball.
The ever-present cultural fit piece of it.
Oh, what is cultural fit?
So, exactly. So, sure. So it's the interviewing for culture fit catch-all, right? Which can be perilous because you're either, I'm going to engage in extremes, right? You're either interviewing for somebody just like you and the people already in the office, right? Which is sort of, I guess, not what you want. We want diversity, right? We want a diversity of thought and people in the room. Or you're so absent that you're interviewing for something that's so ill-defined it feels really squishy and somewhere on the spectrum, right?
Yeah.
And it always seems weird, and it's always an uncomfortable conversation going in. Like, how do we define this, and how do we define our cultural fit?
Yeah, I mean, just figuring out content for interviews and how that matches to different jobs, like for different roles. I mean, that's hard, whether it's behavioral type things, communication, different technical skills. I'm going to move over to this side of the room. Is there anything else that you found that's really hard about interviewing, making hiring decisions?
Oh, I was just going to ask, like, with the cultural fit, isn't that more behavioral versus technical?
Yeah, I mean, but we need a lot of different skills to get to work together and to get work done. So it's definitely, this workshop, we will be focusing on the technical skills, but it was definitely a good point.
Okay. Sorry.
You just throw the box. I think somebody
I don't want to hurt anyone. So last point, is there anything?
Yeah, consistency across candidates and I guess, I don't want to say fairness exactly, but unbiased approach to it.
Yes,
it's difficult to avoid your biases.
Yep, consistency, being unbiased. These are all good points. There's so much. I remember when I first started interviewing, I always wanted like that extra 30 minutes. You know, like I was like, oh, is it like, should I, you know, just the decision making can be quite hard. It probably meant I wasn't a great interviewer because I was squandering some of that time with someone. Maybe, I don't know. It's like, how do we get feedback about how we're doing? Like, how do we know if we're doing a good job? Who's telling us that? Yes.
You feel like you have a good sense of who the candidate is by the end of the interview.
So if you feel like you feel, so you said if you feel like you know the candidate by the end of the interview, so kind of the sense of like ourselves, like how confident do we feel, how well did we connect? What other ways do we get feedback about how we're doing? Go ahead.
12 to 18 months after you hire them, they turn out to be really good.
Yep. Well, so that's a great point. I mean, it's unfortunate that takes so long, but and also what about the people who we don't hire and that are invisible? We never know if we ended up taking another 2 months trying to find someone when we had a great opportunity that we missed. But that's, yeah, trying to close that loop sometime later. What was that?
I thought like the standard, like to try an employee out was 90 days.
90 days. Yeah, I mean, but sometimes you don't know. Sometimes it takes a while for someone to get settled. It can take a long time to really know if a hiring decision, was good. So there's different ways we get feedback. Sometimes it's right after the interview. Sometimes we're pairing up with other people, or we go to this debrief and you get to learn from other people. Oh, what were you looking for? But yeah, often the feedback, it comes much later or not at all, especially for those people we don't hire. And how often are we actually getting feedback from candidates? Like, raise your hand if you've ever gotten feedback from a candidate. And I don't mean a scathing review on Glassdoor. Yeah? That's awesome. And it's a difficult position for a candidate to be in, to give that feedback when they're trying to get a job. So, but it's important that we all talk about interviewing and have this conversation and try to get feedback, because without feedback, we can't improve, right? Like as engineers, we do code reviews. That's how we have a language for talking about, what is code quality and what's maintainability and what are these competencies that we're looking for when we're hiring people. We have to have that cycle. And that's what I'm going for with this workshop. So I could, we only have an hour, but I could come up and say, well, this is exactly the rubric you should use and how you should do your interviewing. And it would be a very tiny fish that I would be giving you in this small amount of time. What we're really going to focus on here, we'll do a little bit of that. You will have some concrete takeaways from this workshop. But what we're really trying to do is teach you to fish and to have this cycle of being able to assess interviewer performance and your interview process so that you can figure out what works for you and your company. Does that sound good? Yes, great. So just to back up, before we jump into some of our activities, I just want to back up and properly introduce myself and let you know what we do at Carrot, just for a little bit of context. I'm not just some random person talking about interviewing. I work for Carrot. It's a company that specializes in technical interviews. So we have companies like Pinterest as a client of ours. They've recruited a ton of candidates, more candidates than their engineers have time to interview, because their engineers are trying to do their jobs. And so at Carrot, we have a ton of interviewers that we've trained to give consistent, predictable, unbiased interviews. So we interview Pinterest candidates. Pinterest then conducts on-sites and continues with the rest of the process. And then because we've integrated with their ATS systems and we're working with them on their full pipeline, we're able to close this feedback loop. And we don't have to wait a year or 18 months, because we've been doing this with tens of thousands of interviews and tons of clients. So we kind of have a data trove that we are able to kind of close that loop a little bit faster for some of our clients. So that's super cool. I mean, that's just the power of when you have a company who can devote all of their time and resources and science and engineering to a problem. That's what we can do. And so we've kind of broken out, we sort of call this the anatomy of an interview process. It has the things we've already talked about, defining what your competencies are, figuring out what your questions are that you're going to ask, and ultimately making a hiring decision and using some data to process and improve and figure out where are your bottlenecks and how can you do this better than your competitors. What we are going to focus on in this interview is actually conducting the interview. Sorry, what we're going to do in this workshop is conducting the interview and assessing performance. So just the real core, the core pieces for interviewing. That's what we're going to focus on. Eli, this thing has stopped working, but I think it's okay. If you can though, thanks. So why focus on this? Just real quick, I just want to say that it is, I think it's one of the best ways that we can have an impact, because not only is interviewing the core of a hiring process, But it's something that all of us can take away from this workshop and apply immediately. We don't always control the full hiring, decision-making process, or maybe even, the question creation. Although as engineers and companies, we often wear a lot of hats and maybe can, really get involved in those ways. But it's a huge impact, and you know what? It's impacting the candidate experience directly, and that's huge, because when we have candidates going through interview processes, they're looking at our companies and deciding whether they want to work with us and whether they want to tell their friends, if, hey, I didn't get this job, but wow, that was such a cool process, like check this out. We love getting that feedback. And it's important to maybe avoid those scathing Glassdoor reviews, because no one wants that. So, yeah, so and also I'm talking about this because this is how I fit into Carrot. So I lead the interviewing community with a team of people here who I'll introduce real quick when we get into our demo. And it's a great community of interviewers and who are really focused on how do we interview interviewers? Like, how do we hire interviewers? How do we lift engineers, senior engineers to be senior interviewers? So we're going to apply some of the processes that we've learned to this workshop, and the core of that being practice and feedback. So. And we have, I'm going to skip through this. Let me just check time. Yeah, I'm going to skip through this, but we have some data that just kind of tells you what you would expect. That the more often you interview, the better you get. If you're just interviewing once a month, you get a little rusty. You kind of forget what's happening. If you're as you've done more interviews, you can get better. Like we see with our interviewers that maybe after 50 interviews, their error rate, so their accuracy, the candidate experience can get it starts to become like really low compared to the interviews they're doing, because it's a lot to, yes.
How do you define what is accurate when there is no defined question and different answer?
What's accurate? Well, what we're going for is like a predictive, an interview process that can be predictive. And so, as for example, if we're going to get to this. It's a good question. Let us dig in. So why don't we move towards that? So. And the main goal is, if it takes 10,000 hours to master something, we don't have 10,000 hours. So that's what we're going to try to build up some tools here so we can have an iterative process, but also so that this process doesn't take forever, that we can sort of immediately start feeling we're doing something in the right direction. So to do this, we're going to start, first of all, with a demo, interview horror story. We have here Eli. He's one of our interviewers. Very active in our performance processes, and he's going to be playing the skeptic. We actually had to spend all weekend practicing with him to like untrain all of his nice mannerisms and get him to be a real jerk. And then we have on the and we have here the unsuspecting victim, Christian, who also on the team, and who will be playing the role of a candidate, just trying to get through and survive. And all of the things that we've all experienced, being like nervous and just trying to understand what the question is. They're going to demo, they're going to do a live demo for us, about 7 minutes long. Take notes on what you see, like assess the interviewer, right? This is not about the candidate in this case. We're not trying to hire Christian. We're trying to see.
Maybe just try to know what the candidate is experiencing from that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, what is the candidate experiencing? That's important. But so take notes about how what the interviewer is doing, and then we'll discuss as a group. And there is, and I'm going to go through the question just real quick so you all have a sense of what this is. We're going to use the same question in the second half of this workshop. We'll pair up, and you all will basically do the same thing, interview each other, to sort of practice it and figure out some other scenarios. And before we get started, let's just figure out what this question is, just so we all have a sense of what's going on. So the point is that we have this elevator, starts on floor 0. There's an input string, in this case, say 3U1D. What that means is that the elevator, it's like a log of where the elevator has moved. So the elevator went 3 floors up, U for up. It went 1 floor down, D for down. And now we want to know, well, what floor is it on? And so it's on floor 2. So the interview question is going to be like, write a function that takes this input and figure out what floor is the elevator on right now. Does that make sense? Any questions about this?
So with the, I see below the sample input output, Are we assuming that for each flow that it's... Nice catch, or throw. So are we assuming that for the sample input output, the 3 at the bottom, that all 3 start at 0 or?
Yep, great question. The elevator always starts at floor 0.
Okay, I just didn't know if like the second one was starting at floor 8 and then it went 1 up, then 2 up, and then blah, blah, blah. Okay, my bad.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And you'll see so in front of you, though, there's some pamphlets. If you're at these tables, you have some pamphlets on the back table over there if you didn't get a chance, if you're standing in the back. There is a page called the interviewer rubric, which you don't have to use it. You're welcome to use it as you're taking notes. Maybe it gives you some ideas. If it's too confusing or too much, like, feel free to ignore. We'll come back to it later. I just want to I want everyone, this is our first time doing this live demo. I'd like everyone to put their hands together and welcome Christian, the unsuspecting victim and the skeptic, to the stage. Okay, action.
All right. We're going to start you out with an easy one. Given an expression string that contains a series of elevator movements, determine the final position of the elevator. Each movement in the input string will consist of the number of floors traversed and a direction of travel, such as 3U for up 3 floors or 1D for down 1 floor. You can assume that the input is always valid and the initial movement begins from floor 0.
Okay. So basically, you want to know where the elevator has gone. Is that right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I got it.
What exactly does the input look like?
It's like 3U for up 3. The input string will consist of the number of floors traversed and a direction of travel, such as 3U for up 3 floors and 1D for down 1 floor.
Okay, I'm just going to write that. So 3U for D, is that a valid input?
Sure, that's fine. Yeah, write some code.
Okay, all right. Okay, I guess the first thing I want to do is just make a character array. So I'll just split on the empty string and create it that way.
Is that split really necessary?
I think so. I think I need to do this for the way I would like to solve it.
What would the space complexity of that be?
I don't know what space complexity is actually.
Okay, yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine. You can do it like that.
Okay. Is it all right if I use split? Is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. First thing, I think I'll just go through the array so long as there's still something in it. I'm gonna just take the first element from the front and look at that. So so to take the first element off, I guess I can't remember, is it pop or split that I use? Could you help me with that?
So you know this is a JavaScript role, right? You need to know JavaScript. You're gonna need to use it on the job. It's very basic JavaScript.
Yeah, I just can't remember this one method. I guess I'll just use pop and I'll come back and fix that if that's a problem. Like, can I do that? Is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. So if temp is not U and temp is not D, then I'll just add temp to the, oh, I need to add a total here. So sorry about that. So yeah, so if temp is not U or D, then I'll just add temp to total, and then I'll just print that out. Oops. Okay, yeah, so that should be it.
All right, go ahead and try it.
So I click the run.
Go ahead.
Okay.
So that's wrong. Do you see the problem there?
I can see that it's wrong. I'm not exactly sure where I went
Because you're
wrong.
concatenating instead of adding. On line 7.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So you're going to have to put a parse int around temp, so it treats it as a number. Parse int, P-A-R-S-E, capital I-N-T.
Oh, thank you.
All right, go ahead and run it again.
Okay. Ah, okay. Yeah, looks good.
7. So what problem are you solving?
So I'm just trying to figure out the total distance that the elevator has gone.
Yeah, so no, no, you're solving the wrong problem. Let's go back to line 1. See how it says 3U, 4D? So that's 3 up, 4 down. Should be -1. And scene. Cool. So what went wrong there? Obviously, a lot of that was exaggerated, but all based on real anecdotes on how poor interviews have gone. Yes, let's start listing things. What went wrong? I'm just going to be here.
The very first thing is the interviewer explained it as an easy problem.
Yes, excellent.
Luckily, they were empty.
So what went wrong there?
I didn't hear in the interview, like up until you said, oh, this is a JavaScript job, you didn't specify what programming language could be used. Like I didn't hear you say this is specifically JavaScript until after he started coding.
Yeah, definitely. Or didn't even give an option to use a different language.
The problem itself was poorly elaborated on, spoken very, very quickly. It was almost hard to hear what the problem was, and I think maybe even used very long and complicated words where they weren't really necessary.
How many floors were traversed? Yeah. That was the last minute addition, actually. Yes. We also didn't provide a written prompt of the problem, so he had nothing to go off other than my condescending sort of clarifications.
There were a ton of little opportunities to ask for clarification that could probe on depth and just skill and depth of understanding, / jumping immediately into code. There was an instant opportunity for like, tell me how you'd break this down. How are you thinking about this? Like the backup one step, right? Which could have then parlayed into like, so why not for each? And why are you using split here? Just tell me more about your choice. Not that necessarily wrong, right? But so much of it is about problem-solving approach as opposed to skill itself, which by extension is a skill. But
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No prompting for approach at all.
There were a ton of microaggressions, so like the responses were all very curt and it wasn't inviting at all. So I think that the interviewee did a great job of like feeling confident in the approach, even though the interviewer was so aggressive.
Wasn't coming through, I guess.
Yeah. It was good. I mean, it was bad, but good.
If the beer shirt.
Okay. I guess you didn't even introduce yourself. That's one thing I noticed.
True. My name's Eli, everybody.
I thought about the experience of being interviewed and like being interrupted every like 5 seconds. You're trying to do anything. Like it's pretty, I don't know, it's just like very hard to not just solve the problem, but like have any kind of composure as an interviewer. So like really kind of breaking up the kind of natural order of solving a problem.
Yeah, that's definitely something we were going for. There were also times where Christian was maybe not, he was going through but wasn't so confident, and maybe just like, oh yeah, that makes sense for me, or something like that would have helped.
Cool. Last one in red.
One thing I saw, and this was for the interviewee, it would have been better if you would have said, hey, I need a few minutes to think about this. Can I get back to you? And then just kind of plot it out a little bit more. It seemed like too much thinking on the feet, which led to this guy interrupting a lot, and it was harder for everyone.
Yes.
Yeah, I think, I do think it's important for the interviewer to give that space for the candidate to think and have time to solve the problem before jumping in. Yeah.
Cool. So I'm going to move on. Which one? Awesome. Yeah, so you guys saw a lot of the issues. I'm going to group them into sort of two categories, right? Some of it was kind of with the content itself, like was this the right question? Was it a confusing question? Was it testing the right competencies? And some of it had to do with just the conduct of the interviewer. And so I'm going to we're going to quickly go through and figure out that, sort of go through this interviewer rubric and talk a little bit about both of those two things. And then you all will have a chance to practice with each other. So let's make sure I can get this back to working. I may need your help. I don't know how to make it go right. Oh, maybe I click there. That'll work. Okay, cool. Cool. So there's a few goals that we have during these interviews. We've talked about this already. It's come up, right? Like accuracy. And I know we had a question already about accuracy, and there'll be a Q&A at the end of this where we can dig into some of this more so. But like, so what is accuracy? How do we be predictive? And ultimately, we want to enable the candidate's best performance. So like at Carrot, for example, we offer free redos because that sort of takes that stress off. And if a candidate does have a bad day, why not let them try again? It's not a free pass. They still have to actually perform well in the interview. We want to see the best performance because that is going to translate more likely to be on the job. And like we said before, we really want to create a positive experience. So we have these different goals. And the way, for our purposes for this workshop, we're kind of breaking it down into these three kinds of interviewer conduct: being clear, being encouraging, providing hints. And that's a tricky one, right? Like when do you provide hints? What hints? What does that mean for the assessment? So that one's definitely a tricky one. And then this idea of how do we assess the candidate? Like we can have the perfect interview, but if afterwards we can't talk about it with the rest of the team and make the right hiring decision, we've wasted that situation. So both of those things are important. And having this idea of deliberately what signals are we looking for versus what is noise will then feed back into the rest of this. So let's just look at each of these items with a few more examples before we go into it. Chen. I don't have the box. Oh, here it is. Oof.
So you're looking at it from a very positive angle. Encouragement is good. But when I think of medical residency, that's meant to break a doctor before they finish the program. I'm not saying we should do that to every candidate, but let's say you're in a sales position, you're in a customer service position. There are times when you do want to see how people react to negative scenarios.
I think if it's sort of in a work sample, if it's tied to the work environment, like, hey, for a DevOps candidate, maybe let's do there's this emergency happens and we're going to try and debug it, and the faster you can do it, the better. If you kind of tie it to the work, because the candidate knows what they're getting in for. That's part of the job requirements and the skills that they have and that they can bring to it. If it's like we're just writing software for this website and we need to be able to be stressed out about it, if it's trying to figure out, this is where you want to be deliberate, right? There isn't a right answer. It may be the case for you, but like these additional skills that we try to, being a fast learner, that's probably important. Being good under pressure, maybe that's important. Just be careful of them, right? It kind of gets into like culture fit a little bit. And the more like the most likely answer, honestly, is that the strongest teams have a lot of different skills coming together. When we made this workshop, there's like 6 of us involved, and we all took up different pieces and contributed in different ways. That this is the best workshop that I've ever been a part of, because when I do it by myself, it's only got my strengths. So that's the only other thing I would say, to be careful about different competencies. But it's good question. Yep. So let us dig into some of them a little bit more so. For example, with clarity. So like, this is a good question. Sometimes you might have you ever been at a debrief and someone said, you know what, this candidate, they didn't even talk about the edge cases. They didn't even write tests. Or like, this candidate, they got a working solution, but their code looks really, spaghetti-like. And the important thing is, well, did the interviewers ask? Did the interviewer say, hey, can you think of some edge cases? And so that's like an example of, well, if the competency is reading minds, they've failed. But that's probably not what you need, because you're in a collaborative environment where you're able to talk about things and figure out, like in a code review, what how much technical debt is appropriate in this case. So it's important to be open about the behavior you're assessing. Like, for example, what edge cases would you test to build confidence in the correctness of your code? And then let them, give some edge cases, and maybe they don't find all of them. That's a good signal, if that's important to you. Encouragement. So we don't want to encourage poor performance or a poor candidate experience. And they're both important. And I think we really, I think this demo demonstrated a lot of that. So I won't go into that too much, but just be aware of the body language. Sometimes as interviewers, we can be nervous. Like, maybe it's like we don't interview all the time, and we might be like closed off and not making eye contact or not being relaxed. And then that's going to impact the candidate. If I was interviewing Eli and I'm standing and he's sitting, I mean, that's kind of a weird power dynamic. So body language is also important, just as much as the things we say. And the reason, by the way, the reason I broke out all these 3 different points, they're all kinds of communication. You could say they're all forms of guidance. Being clear is almost like free guidance. It's like actually going to tell you what to expect. Being encouraging, also free guidance. Being able to say, oh yeah, I can see what you're doing there, or great, you've got it working. You've got it running, but there looks like there's some bugs. Like, you're not giving a hint. So the hint is another kind of communication, another kind of guidance that actually is now maybe it's a signal about their performance. I don't know if that makes sense. But you're the host of this conversation. So all of your communication, you want to be a good host and guide. You want to guide this interaction. So these are like 3 different ways that you're communicating. And the one thing I will also say is about skepticism. This last point, be encouraging and ask the follow-up questions. So you don't want to be externally skeptical. Like if Eli's telling me about his project, I'm like, no, really, what did you do? Like, I don't believe you did that. What a position to put him in, But I might have that thought internally. Like, I shouldn't be taking things for granted. That's why we're doing an interview. So I should still ask those follow-up questions. Tell me about the API. What did that response look like? Walk me through this method or something. So does that make sense? Like, be internally critical. Think critically. Don't wash that away just because you're being polite.
So as a soon-to-be candidate, and I'll be seeing y'all, I can for sure, like, I know like the first couple of interviews I'll be nervous, like for real, but as soon as I get a couple under my belt, I'll be a little bit better. So I think just for me, like asking like, hey, this is your first interview, you've been doing this for a while, it could be very helpful of like understanding the mindset of where I'm at, for sure, because like the first interview I'm gonna be pooping a little bit.
I love that. Unless your competency that you require is not being nervous. Nervousness should just be noise, not a signal. Okay, so, and then there's guidance. I forgot about this one. So the main thing about guidance is to consider what is harmful and what is beneficial, right? So you don't want to give, if a candidate's thick in some solution, you're not, the common thing is like, don't push them towards a particular solution. And the reason for that is if you just confuse someone, then they just get off their game. You end up wasting their time. So let them, meet them where they are, right? What solution they're trying to do. helping them with the solution is different than helping with the question. So Christian just spent like 7 minutes in that demo solving the wrong problem. And this was a waste of time for everyone, right? Like that's just noise, that he didn't understand that the elevator was, that it was supposed to be what floor is it on, not how much distance it traveled. So we just wasted like 10 minutes there. And so, you know, clarify the question. If you can, you know, there's multiple sample inputs. Maybe, you know, hey, Christian, why don't you walk me through the second input? Like what, you know, try and get the clarification out earlier. That's free. Let's see, so that kind of thing. You guys get it. When you are giving guidance, you're gonna have to figure this out for your team and for what works for you, like what kind of guidance you're trying to give for a particular question and what that ramp up looks like. Because you're trying to figure out what guidance can you give that's just getting them through that noise, like split versus pop. I don't know, people can look up documentation. So maybe you can decide as a team that looking up methods is fine, or maybe you say, oh, we'll just give candidates that answer so they can show us more of their skills. So that kind of thing, you kind of want to figure out what your ramp up is and do that incrementally. Yes?
When you can figure out with...
Can I throw it to you?
When you can figure out what the strengths and weaknesses of the candidate after a certain point, at least in my experience, there's no point pushing the candidate further on that with giving hints and then letting them do. Instead, I would just say, okay, I understand where you stand in this. Let me switch the gears, go somewhere else.
Yeah, that's great.
That's what I would personally suggest to do rather than trying to give hints and then push further. And most of the times, my experience, candidates actually confidence goes down further and further. Even though you're trying to help, they don't feel that way.
Totally, yeah. Maybe you have other questions, other directions. Yes.
So how much do you purposely leave the opening question vague so that they ask questions versus spelling everything out?
No right answer. These are all things that you want to be able to close the loop on. But I would say, for example, in this question, we talked about this as a team. In the sample input, there's a floor with 2 digits. So that it's clear in the input that you can have floors with multiple digits so that it's not like a surprise later. That needs to be handled. It doesn't mean that there aren't, you know, edge cases, maybe, or difficult situations. If you want to have some things unclear, I would just say make sure to just state that up front. Say, you know, we've got this partial spec here, and we don't have it all figured out. Come up with that. That's a suggestion. You know, what we're gonna do is the main takeaway I want you all to have is to be able to have these conversations, these interview reviews, so that you can kind of figure out what's working for you. And part of that is having a very clear rubric so that you have the right data points. I'm just going to move on to that. So here's the thing. You've just done this interview, and maybe one of your data points was like, oh, this person didn't clarify the problem at the beginning, and it turned into a bug later. So you've done this interview, and that's part of, you know, the first level that we often do if we don't, you know, have more guidance, is we just have these random, like, sort of unstructured thoughts. Like you write a paragraph, or you just come to a debrief and you say what happened. And the problem with this gets at your at the accuracy question, is that if 2 interviewers watch that same interview, they might have different unstructured thoughts. And so then they might be totally different. Like one person was looking for follow-up questions, and someone else was looking for testing. And it said like, oh, this candidate was great. Oh, this candidate did not, it was awful, right? And like that makes it more about the interviewer than the candidate, right? Like a candidate the decision should not depend on who is in the room. It's true for software, it's true for interviewing. So what the kind of next stage that we often do is we define these categories and associate like stars. Like I call it the Yelp review. Sorry, Neil. But we all know what Yelp is. So, you know, you might say like, these are the 3 things we care about. And that at least tells you that maybe there's some other things that aren't as important, but we might not know like what's a 2 versus a 3. And so the next step is to start specifying what that means. So that now interviewers have the same language to talk about these assessments, and we're more likely to at least have the same form in a sense after an interview. Now, what does that mean for an overall decision, that's the next level. Like, you have to have more guidance. Does this mean a yes or no? How strong is that? If you can even get some kind of algorithmic, you can apply machine learning. That's more of what we're looking at Carrot, because we have so much data here. And the ultimate is to have this formal review process. Like, just like there's code reviews, have an interview review process where you actually have 2 interviewers, in the room or on the video, and you see if they're in agreement about a process or what it means, right? Does that make sense? And so that's the point. You have this real professional looking interviewer, and both of them are getting to the same conclusion. And look how happy the candidate is. Like, he has a dog now. It's just like interview bliss. All right, so that's the interview rubric. I've been talking up here for long enough. We're gonna do a pair situation where everyone's gonna divide up into teams of 2 or 3 people. You'll have different roles, and you'll sort of use this time to ask the same question of each other for about 5 to 10 minutes. And then there'll be some debrief questions where you can kind of give each other feedback, so you can kind of learn and improve. And I'm just going to go over these roles real quick. So first, one of the things that you have is this paper board. It's like a whiteboard, but it's less rigid. If you have your computer, you're welcome to use your computer and use CoderPad or some other programming environment, but this is like kind of a whiteboard for sketching out a solution. And you have a question guide as the interviewer. So before things start, make sure you and the candidate have a chance to read your respective sheets of paper, make sure you're on the same page about clarifying questions and whatnot. For the candidate, we have a sheet of personas. So you're not a real candidate. Don't be nervous. You can throw away the personas and just do it as you would normally. That's fine. We have personas in case you want to try to be super nervous and inexperienced, or talkative and easily distracted. And we've listed some of the things you can do to help you out, to give the interviewer practice. So we also provided a possible solution, which you're welcome to just use as a blatant cheat sheet, if that is helpful for you. And again, it's, having a hard time is good. If you are a perfect candidate, anyone can interview a perfect candidate. So feel free to make mistakes. And lastly, there's an observer role optional, but if there's folks here who maybe aren't engineers and aren't comfortable being in either of those roles, feel free to join a pair and observe and use that interviewer rubric to take some notes and give feedback at the end. Super helpful. And these will be the debrief questions that you guys will chat about at the end. Are there any questions before we break up? You guys ready? Yeah? Okay. And just raise your hand if you are an interviewer at Carrot, and we'll be walking around just so you guys know who you can ask questions for. That's Helene and Sarah Beth, Christian, Eli, myself. Great.
And maybe raise your hand if you were more likely to be a candidate in an upcoming interview than an interviewer. Awesome. So these folks, you should maybe come see a Carrot interviewer, and we'll get everybody paired off.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if you're a candidate, go find an interviewer. Definitely, everyone gets to practice. Okay.
All right. So do you want to partner?
Let's start.
Yes. So you can't do it, right? Your mic makes more sense.
Unless give me 20 years.
Okay.
Same thing when I started. So basically, you're here to work. I've done it. Very important. And right now, operating systems are not in any other language like JavaScript. They're only in one language. Exactly. I don't think anytime you want to write a different operating system in JavaScript. I don't think so. I have the only written C and C. So my product is back to school. I don't have code. I have the guy who I think the code is actually the restaurant part. So when I have here, I don't look at the language. I look at here is how you because you have dictionary, you don't use it. You can put up because your idea how to explain it. Makes sense?
So if you put these are inputs, it can be anything like that. There is a number, how far it goes, and then for the view or as you see your if you have any questions at this point, don't worry about us.
Yeah, so you want to know the final don't write out the words. That's too complicated. We just want to know where you get off. However you're busy, that's yeah, there's a great question I can ask. Go ahead and write it out. But I would like to say, I just prepared. Obviously, sometimes we'll do that. No, you know what?
Now, are there going to be, how many floors are there? Do I have just a single, 9 floors, or am I going to be able to go up?
There's no upper or lower bound.
Okay, so I can go down as far.
I know one of you want. Are you looking for a job? You are looking for a job. Maybe this is a wrong combination. You want experience of being in the I think you should go to the you want
And really, I probably like that.
I can make it.
How comfortable what are cons of using it?
That's why I'm like, okay,
So I agree with what you said.
I am fairly new to Python, so this is just where I'm but I have to kind of separate the letter. making sure that it's
I'm going to be there, but I don't want one of them to become observers like post. Instead, I want them to have an opportunity to do it. Do you want to come and interview on that? You don't need an answer. You can just do an interview. So why don't you go interview? That's right.
So you were to look at this problem and you were to say, like, when we give you the sample, what do you literally do to get this answer in your head? What do you do?
I don't know.
I started here, I add 3, I add 9.
How do you know to add 9?
It's going through.
But how do you know to not add new, or what makes you like hand on that?
Because I instead of so I have to add
Right. And so, you know, if I were to, regular expressions to me are hard to explain in that place. To me, when I think this out loud in solving it, I say, hey, I'm going to go until I see either you or then I'm going to go again until I see you, and I'm going to go again until I see you. And that's all you do if you use something like expression, you're making it kind of because again, you'll see it later. But when you run into digits, things like getting out of so I think in Python there is a slice or I don't know if this is, I can't remember if this is, but let's assume you have some type of function that, or a meta that you can say, hey, divide.
And I think I've used that before. Yeah, it's
That's okay.
Let's see. Right. So, yeah, see, as we're going by, I'm thinking that this one, like what I would probably prefer to see, especially because this one is more complicated, is the more simple, hey, can you get a solution? So, something as much as you're splitting and say, hey, go purchase everything you see as and then just check stop the limiter
I was trying to jump right into that. So I think really what I would say is like first return the question and then kind of outline kind of how it's going and then start jumping into that so that I have an idea of where I want to go and stuff on the first step.
see that a lot. Let's look at the syntax on this for this while and feel that later.
Hey guys, just a heads up to start wrapping up and move on to the debrief questions and give each other feedback.
So I think the fact that you
Yeah. Oh, perfect timing. Okay. Squeeze by you. That's all right. You're fine. I'm just gonna. I go get it.
I think sometimes I felt like I love this will help you, but I didn't say anything about it, so I wasn't asking for
I told you guys to try to assess whether they're calling something or something. Trying to call someone, and I don't want to interrupt. It certainly is teaching. I've noticed a lot of people give you a chance to, or especially when they're asking you a question, it's not written down necessarily. So preface it with half of the and don't give them too much. Just ask them somebody who can but yeah, because also we can get and we don't want to get hung up on this. I want to get you to like, all right, what's your outcome? See this, what do I do? And then I should do this episode to see like the possibilities and how you do it ready. What I often say is,
when somebody has a cue instead of you.
This is what I meant to say, you know, like all these things about it.
So a couple minutes we'll do get everyone's attention. We'll have callback. Definitely let everyone go while you're
I love this. I used to do this.
Now, if you ever need to work up this out, you're ready to go.
No, anytime you want. Like with more planning, better stuff.
I'm very conscious, but sometimes I get so aware.
In my head, I'm like, maybe you want to come to New York City.
I'm conscious of all these times. Are they actually?
Yeah, we're pushing there.
Not specific. In a high stakes situation, not like video.
We'll figure it out.
Yeah.
We'll do it differently next time. So I'm gonna, I think, grab everyone's attention. I always hate doing that, but I think we want to bring people back. So start clapping. Nice work, everyone. Nice work. You're all hired. You did a great job in this interview.
Good job, everyone.
So I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're gonna just so that we don't keep you too late, kind of want to do the wrap up. If there's any anything that y'all want to share from your debrief with the group, things that were interesting or that you learned, even if they seem mundane. Yeah?
Box. Maybe get one of these. So I picked the silent persona to kind of like trip them up, and I wrote the spaghetti code. So as soon as it basically gave me the correct prompts and instructions to get started, asked if there were any clarifications that needed to happen. I said nope, just went into writing spaghetti. But then after that, like he just did not, prompt or push any direction on the problem, but it gave me the space to kind of after the fact say, can you clarify your decisions or walk me through the process, which was, I think, a good way to kind of like honor the style. Like I want to kind of just do this on my own without the personal prompts, but at the same time, give me an opportunity to defend it and then resolve the problems after the fact and maybe talk about it.
Yes, that's awesome. And
was
sometimes, you really do want to have that approach conversation. And the way I look at it is you want to open the door for the candidate to demonstrate things you're looking for. So maybe you do try and ask for them to talk about the approach. But if someone's style, some people aren't comfortable, they think with their hands a little bit and play with the code or maybe the communication isn't where they're at right now. You open the door, but you don't want to push it too hard. If you find the back door, so like let them start the code and then have the conversation. That's super smart.
One thing we talked about that was related was to whiteboard or not to whiteboard. Great debate, right? Even among our group here. And two, people have different learning styles and thinking styles and ways of communicating, and it's one of many. Have definitely had candidates in the room where couldn't write the code for beans on the whiteboard, but could explain it in perfect detail verbally, and vice versa, right? Like wrote beautiful code, turned the paper around and handed it to me. I looked at it, I'm like, nailed it. I don't, like, speaks for itself, right? So yeah, it was some of that, like crack the door open for the other ways of communicating and find out sort of what their default setting is.
And if you're trying to, and part of this is if you're trying to enable other interviewers at your org, they might think that that the candidate has to whiteboard. Like they may not know that kind of flexibility. So that's why having these conversations can be really helpful.
So as an interviewee, it's very kind of nervous when it's your first time interviewing or like first couple times interviewing. So it's really helpful for me for when you first meet the interviewer, just to like have some small talk, even for the interview, maybe say a joke or even smile. That kind of calms you down, just so you know that it's not adversarial and turns into more of a conversation than it is just an interview. So it's really helpful for the other person to be personable and nice to the interviewee.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
What else behind you?
I think one of the things that I was able to observe in the situation here, because you had just said it, is the kind of encouragement versus hints. And because you just said it, and it seemed really important to me, so I was kind of watching for that. And I think Jesse did an excellent job of encouraging, kind of keeping things moving, right? But not, solving the problem, right? So it was still, it was still clear he was still doing his assessment. But was, wasn't all Eli about it, right?
Oh, no, I'm so sorry.
Thank you.
Awesome.
So that's not exactly hyperbole. Oh, yeah. Actually, it was literally so bad. The person was like, I'm going to end this interview now. You're not a fit. It wasn't in person. It was like, but I mean, still, I understand where they were coming from because, the whole point of like interviewing is to find a potential candidate. You don't want to waste time. But that was just straight up rude.
Yeah, I'm sorry that happened. That sucks.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
This is the first time I've done an interview for a while where I'm actually face-to-face with the candidates and where we're not dealing with half a second of Skype lag and where we're face-to-face and where we share the same first language. And I have to say, it's a lot more fun and easy than a lot of the interviews I end up doing.
Cool. Fun workshop.
I thought it was a little bit tricky to get started because I program mainly in JavaScript, and it's a little weird to break stuff apart because that's not what I do a lot. I did come up with a solution that would have worked, but only at the end did my interviewer let me know it would only work for a 9-floor building.
Thanks. Anyone else?
And that's a tricky case as the interviewer. I mean, for how do you assess that? Like, what does that mean for your performance? Oh, you got a working solution, but there's a bug. That's, you have to kind of work out with, what that would mean.
For me, this comes from personal experience, but like one of the first things that we ran into was my candidate, couldn't remember the particular syntax for a for loop, and I literally I've been programming for 10 years now, and I literally have to Google how to do a for loop if I haven't been programming for a week. So especially because we were using paper and not an IDE, just saying like, yep, just assume you wrote a correct for loop and just keep going. And I feel like you ended up getting to the interesting part of the interview much faster just because we were able to just like skip past that.
Good call.
And also, as soon as you said it was okay, 2 seconds later, it just came right out of my head, wherever it was stuck.
That's amazing. So as soon as he was like, no, it's okay, you're like, oh, I know the syntax. Yeah, that's such a great way to get apart brain freeze. Yeah, the brain freeze. Yeah, right on.
Yeah, I was playing the confused and inexperienced, which isn't too far off. And my interviewer started out saying, the intro that you can ask any clarifying questions you want. And that was really, really helpful, knowing that, I had that total leeway, and gave me, silence for, quiet to kind of hem and haw my way through the code. And there was, encouraging, which wasn't intrusive, but still good encouragement. And I really appreciated that. So there's little things you can do that are encouraging that's not going to break train of thought.
That's awesome. And that reminds me, candidates get all sorts of weird training. Like we see this sometimes where candidates assume that like their code has to work perfectly before they run it, or like that they can't ask clarifying questions. Like you don't know what kind of weird training they've got, and that shouldn't, that's noise, not signal. So being explicit, yeah, super important. Cool. Well, this was, I'm so glad you guys came to this workshop. It was super fun. Lots of great conversations. We do have time for those who want to stick around for maybe 15 minutes of just general Q&A or about interviewing in general, or just networking and conversations in the back. There's a great spread in the back, and I think we have the space is open to everyone until 8, so no rush. And if you do have any feedback about this workshop, we're doing a series. We have a couple more workshops coming up this summer at Stack Overflow in New York City, at the Chan Zuckerberg Institute in the Bay Area. So if you have any feedback about this workshop, please send me an email or just flag me down. I'd love to hear it. If you have any questions about interviewing, or if you're interested in becoming an interviewer or an engineer at Carrot, we are hiring. Feel free to get in touch. And just as a heads up, we also offer free practice interviewing for candidates. If you go to carrot.io/practice, you can sign up and do something kind of similar to what Eli and Christian demonstrated, but this time with a really nice interviewer.
And at the end of those practice interviews, there's 15 to 30 minutes of verbal feedback that the interviewer gives you, and you can ask questions and kind of do a retrospective of the interview with the interviewer.
Cool. Well, thanks. Yeah, so if come up to the front if you want to do some Q&A.
So what's the hardest skill for you to assess? Like you guys keep a lot of stats, right?
And part of that is because, actually, I know we'll talk about it. He was our CTO. Yes, what is our hardest skill to assess? I jumped out.